The Honourable Member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate my colleague from Wandafuka for a truly thoughtful presentation on this whole issue. Well balanced, taking security into account and family life for our Prime Minister, who has a very demanding job. And once again, let me reiterate that the motion we're here to debate today has nothing to do with that. Really, if we look at the wording of the motion, it reads that in the opinion of the House, government planes, and in particular the plane used by the Prime Minister, should only be used for government purposes and should not be used to transport anyone other than those associated with such purpose or those required for the safety and security of the Prime Minister and his family. So as my colleague mentioned, we've already taken that into consideration. And this motion doesn't go as far as many of the cabinet ministers sitting on the front bench would have gone if there had been a different government in power. We've all read quotes, and during the day you've heard innumerable of them, where they actually questioned why the Prime Minister could not get on a regular plane like other Canadians. We do have business class at the front, and those accommodations can be made. And and there are countries where Prime Ministers actually do that. And our cabinet ministers get on the planes all the time. But this motion isn't about getting the Prime Minister off the Challenger and onto a commercial flight. Because the world has changed. The world has changed since 9/11, and we are far more conscious of our security. And that's why I'm proud to be standing up and speaking for a motion that takes that into consideration. However, it behooves us then that when there is a government plane to be used for government business and also to transport the Prime Minister and his family for security reasons, that's what the plane is used for. If you then turn around and suddenly put your bagman, whose job is to travel around the country to make money for the Conservative Party, and it doesn't matter if they're enjoying a holiday with you, because they can make their own way there and join you when you get there on the other side. And this is not the purpose of the Challenger and its availability to the Prime Minister. And it's because of that that Canadians are paying attention. Last week I heard all this rhetoric. Well, the fundraiser, he paid back at commercial value. Well, he paid back $200 and something for a trip he took over the Christmas period. And I would like to know, who can find a commercial flight
for $2,000?
Yeah, across this country for just over $200 during the peak period.
Yeah.
And for those of us who actually have to shop around for cheap flights, we know that that is just not possible. And also, I noted with interest that it's for a Prime Minister who was very, very vocal, by the way, I would say almost vitriolic in his criticism of the Liberal Party, and by the way, justified, because there were all kinds of abuses, and none of us who are working people in Canada and taxpayers can stand for that kind of largesse. That kind of largesse that gives you a sense of entitlement just because constituents have enough faith in you, have trusted you to become a member of Parliament. And it's that kind of a largesse that really, really is concerning Canadians now. Because the very Prime Minister that used to be a vocal kind of voice against that kind of largesse by my colleagues in the far corner, is now finding himself caught in the same thing. And I noticed that the rules were changed once the Prime Minister became a Prime Minister. So now, since the Prime Minister has been leading the government, now whoever travels with him only has to repay, and he does, at economy rate. And, you know, to me, that seems a little bit strange, Mr. Speaker, and I would say that we need to take a look at that. Traveling on the Challenger, I'm sure, is anything but traveling economy class, never mind all the convenience and everything else. But here is a quote from the Prime Minister back in April on April the 25th, 2005. That is a quote taken from the Prince George Citizen. What Mr. Martin wants now is to have a 10-month election campaign where he can fly around the country on a government jet at taxpayers' expense. And he can throw enough money all over the country to cover up the stench of corruption. Well, so what has changed, Mr. Speaker? That's the question taxpayers would be asking today, and I'm sure a lot of the people who voted for the government in power right now will be asking themselves the same question. What has changed? So we went from one party of entitlement to a party that smacks them over and over again for their entitlement, and now that they are in government, they feel they're entitled to those same entitlements. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I've heard my colleagues across the way make these obtuse arguments about flyers, like 10%ers that went into a riding, that, by the way, Elections Canada has cleared and said all the rules were followed because they went out long before the election got called. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, let me remind the colleagues across the way, it's not the opposition who determines the date of the by-election and therefore can start planning backwards. That is determined by the government. And so those 10%ers and those communications went out well ahead of the election having been announced by the government side. But here we have right now, and what's brought us to be debating this, is you have a fundraiser, a guy who has raised over $3.5 million. I'm sure much more than that, that's just what's out there. $3.5 million, he gets to travel on the Challenger to go to another place where he's speaking, not government business, and he gets to buy a ticket for just over $200. You know what, Mr. Speaker, there are times when I want to travel with my friends on the plane. And I can't always do that when I'm coming here on MP business as a parliamentarian. And sometimes they have to travel on a different plane. And sometimes a different part of the plane. And that, Mr. Speaker, is right. Just because you're friends with the Prime Minister does not then entitle you to use a government asset to make partisan gains for a political party. And that's what this debate is here today. And I cannot wait to hear a substantive argument from my colleagues across the way that could justify such gargantuan largesse, such a sense of entitlement. And let me say, and I'm going to repeat this, Mr. Speaker, because sometimes it's hard for my colleagues to pay attention, but I'm really hoping that they will pay attention to this. And that is, Mr. Speaker, right in this motion is taken into consideration the safety and security of the Prime Minister and his family. This motion is not about the Prime Minister travelling on the Challenger. This motion is about non-government business people travelling on that plane, like fundraisers. And the Prime Minister goes to all kinds of events. And, as an elected leader, that's his right. He gets invited, he goes. But what is not his right is to take his fundraiser and put him on a government plane. Because nobody, I'm always open to be persuaded, but I don't think anybody could ever persuade me that having a fundraiser on a plane is government business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the honourable member might share for me, because I know she's obviously done a little bit of research, she seems to have anyway, if she could share for me how many times over the past 8 years individuals other than government officials have actually been on the Challenger. Has she looked at the manifests, and can she identify for me the amount of times that a private individual has been on that Challenger? I doubt you can, so I'm going to help you. 8 times. 8 times in 8 years. A private individual has been on that Challenger and has repaid the equivalent cost to the taxpayer, a policy that wasn't in place before. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, the individual that she talks about is a very close friend of the Prime Minister, somebody who's been a friend of the Prime Minister's for a long, long time, Mr. Speaker, somebody who is trusted by the family to take care of the kids when the Prime Minister is on foreign vacations. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, this is an individual who might be in the exact same city as the Prime Minister, on a jet that is empty outside the Prime Minister. Is she really suggesting that on those very few occasions that the Prime Minister is to be cocooned and this individual is to be sent somewhere else and not allowed to be on that plane?
The Honourable Member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, and I want to thank my colleague across the way for his question. You know, I don't have access to all the manifests, but I would be really delighted. I haven't accessed them. But, you know, if you could table them, it'll save me having to do some digging and research. If you could request them. Yeah. But...
Order. Just if we could ask all honourable members to control themselves, and the Honourable Member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm always in control. And just to let you know that the request was made of me, and what I'm asking my colleague across the way is if he could table those documents that he has alluded to. But what I want to say is, all of us have friends. All of us have friends who are very dear friends. But suddenly I'm hearing today that this friend is also a kind of a nanny and looks after the kids as well. And you know what? It still doesn't justify it in this case, because that isn't why he was travelling with the Prime Minister. And let me tell you this, it was not government business. It had nothing to do with endangering the Prime Minister's security or his family's security. This is abuse.